This device, what we noticed was that both the all-cause mortality and the cardiovascular mortality were quite a bit lower than what had been seen previously in other IDE studies, and even within other studies of Endologix grafts. And that caused everyone to scratch their heads and say, is there something particular about this that could be having an impact on cardiovascular event rates? And that led us to proceed with the analysis. So we took the EVAS patients from the US IDE study, and then for a comparison group we chose the VQI registry and looked at all patients who underwent traditional EVAR. We had 15,000 patients that way, and we chose the VQI because we were able to find a whole host of important variables to match on, including demographics as well as a broad range of comorbid conditions that had been chosen when the VQI was initiated and then updated again when we wanted even more detail more recently, precisely for the reason that we found that those were the important variables that would impact both the perioperative outcomes and the late outcomes. So cardiovascular risk factors such as cardiac disease, renal disease, heart failure, all the things that impact perioperative and late survival, and included in that anatomic details like importantly aneurysm diameter. And by accounting for all of those variables, it allows us to do a more meaningful comparison between the two groups. The primary finding was that in the EVAS group, their 3-year mortality was substantially lower than in the EVAR group. There was a 41% reduction in overall mortality across that time period. And then when we broke that down into groups based on aneurysm diameter, we found that the bulk of the benefit was in those who had aneurysms larger than 5.5 centimeters, where they actually had a 50% reduction in overall mortality. Probably for a variety of reasons, but patients with larger aneurysms have more of an inflammatory effect. Prior studies have shown that with increasing aneurysm diameter, there's an increase in wall stress, there's an increase in production of inflammatory mediators like MMP3 and 9, and much of that can be abated by successful exclusion of an aneurysm, but that's not the case if there's an endoleak. And with this graft, it minimizes endoleak, but also decreases the transmission of pressure, in particular pulsatile pressure, to the aneurysm wall. And the aneurysm wall still is perfused through the adventitia, and that may be the source of ongoing inflammation. Additionally, the process of sac thrombosis requires an inflammatory response, and then changes in the sac over time also can induce an inflammatory response. And the other thing that we found previously with the VQI database was that patients with sac regression had the best late survival, and sac expansion patients did the worst, but even stable sacs did worse than those with sac regression, and that was independent of endoleak or reintervention. So that also made us wonder that is there some other effect potentially of that aneurysm wall mediated by the pressure or the presence of thrombus between the graft and the wall that contributes to an ongoing inflammatory state that can be mitigated by exclusion of that free area inside the aneurysm with the polymer-filled endobag. I think the results of this study definitely support the concept of active sac management, and certainly support ongoing experimentation with EVAS, and also experimental ways of applying this more broadly. using other technology that involves this obliteration of the sac and active sac management. Certainly, I think these results are very promising and exciting and should be stimulating further research and further product development. Yeah, I think for us to confirm our hypotheses that this is mediated through an inflammatory process that leads to adverse cardiovascular events, we'll need to look long-term at cardiac events, so we can look for patients who come back in with MI, stroke, or cardiac death. We can also look even longer term for ongoing differences in survival. We did notice that the survival curves were starting to separate fairly quickly in the analysis and then continued to separate over time, which again supports the hypothesis that there is an ongoing inflammatory state with traditional EVAR that can be mitigated with EVAS. But I think we need to prove that further with longer follow-up and with a more detailed analysis of what's happening to those patients. Are there actual cardiovascular events and cause of death if we can get at that information as well?